Ukraine is transforming into a new European power, and the war that was supposed to destroy it could instead make it central to Europe's future. In fact, Ukraine is becoming a country that Europeans need. On one hand, for the defense industry because it is creating production capacity, innovations and expertise, while on the other hand, for European defense itself because Kyiv has real war experience that other European countries do not have. I've noticed that many of you watch my videos and I'm really happy about it, but you're not subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, please subscribe. It's free for you, but it's really vital for the channel. Thank you very much. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Kyiv's integration into the West was a slow and problematic process. After the invasion, however, it became a strategic necessity for both Ukrainians and Europe. In fact, for decades, Europe lived as if war was a thing of the past, and its armies were neglected and above all gained no experience, or almost none. By contrast, Ukraine has gained that experience and is still gaining it. Today, in fact, Kyiv's army knows what it means to use drones, to fight with limited resources, and to protect power plants while the enemy tries to destroy them. And above all, it knows how to innovate. That's why today many countries look to Ukraine as a country to learn from. In fact, Ukrainian military technology is attracting the interest of both the United States and Europe. Because many low-cost Ukrainian solutions are moving faster than expensive Western systems. Because often the West works with extremely costly systems and complex industrial cycles. Ukraine, on the other hand, has been forced to do the opposite. Produce quickly, spend less, and adapt. Let's take the example of drones. For years, they were seen as almost a niche field. Now they are central to the conflict, and Ukraine is among the world's most advanced countries in drone use. That's why about 20 countries are interested in signing drone agreements with Ukraine, and 4 agreements have already been signed, and this changes everything. Because if other countries want agreements with you on drones, it means that now you are a country that can sell expertise, technology, and experience. And if at the beginning of the conflict the image was that of a Ukraine that resists only because the West helps it, today the image is much more complex. Because the West does help Ukraine, and that's a crucial help, let's remember that. But at the same time, Ukraine is starting to return the favor by bringing its defense industry to the table. That's something Europeans need. Because Europe is rich but still militarily fragile. It produces little, slowly, and has limited stockpiles. Moreover, it still depends heavily on the United States in many areas. And Ukraine has these problems. It can help us mitigate them. In fact, consider that the production capacity of Ukraine's defense industry is estimated to be between $50 and $55 billion in 2026, and it covers over 50% of the needs of the Ukrainian army. This industrial base is growing despite the risk of Russian attacks, which Moscow is actively attempting. Some Ukrainian companies are now producing abroad for this reason, and the first Ukrainian military facility in the UK is already operating. With the goal of creating synergy among Western countries and establishing a second production line to ensure continuity. And this process can also be seen in the European loan of 90 billion euros to Ukraine. It's meant to support the country in 2026 and 2027. But the interesting point is how this money can be used. In fact, 60 out of the 90 billion are for Ukraine both to grow its own defense industry and to buy military products. Europe is lending money that could partly return to European companies, and the Ukrainian parliament has already ratified the European loan agreement. And the government plans to receive 45 billion euros in 2026 and another 45 in 2027. And these funds will allow Ukrainian defense spending to rise to about $100 billion in 2026 compared to a previous forecast of 64 billion SA. All this money will strengthen not only Ukrainian defense but also European industry and deterrence. And all this tells us that Ukraine is no longer just trying to survive but is becoming a hub of military demand and production. And governments and long-term agreements are taking shape around this demand. And a perfect example is the case of the Swedish Gripen fighter jets. And they are for air defense, attack and interception. In fact, Ukraine will buy 20 new fighter jets from Sweden. Meanwhile, Stockholm will donate another 16 older ones already in 2027. And it seems that Kyiv intends to purchase a total of as many as 150 Gripen, with deliveries of the new models expected from 2030. Here we are talking about a new phase of European military integration because Ukraine is building its own air force within a European ecosystem. And Sweden, in turn, is integrating its own industry into Ukraine's military future. And so the country is becoming both a partner market and a field laboratory. Even the United Kingdom wants to join, negotiating to take part in the 90 billion euro European loan for Ukraine and access defense orders funded by it. Because those who participate will be able to obtain contracts, cooperation, and above all access to Ukrainian experience much more easily. And all of this naturally worries Moscow. The Kremlin has already accused European countries of getting more involved in the conflict, citing their plans to boost weapon production and supplies to Ukraine. And obviously, Putin uses this narrative to say that Europe is part of the conflict and also to strengthen his internal rhetoric, which portrays Russia as heroically opposing the West that wants to crush it. Aside from Russian propaganda, the conflict is increasingly integrating Ukraine and Europe in defense. Ironically, this is the opposite of Putin's goal, as he invaded Ukraine to stop it from aligning with Europe and the West. And actually, the Russian president could have at least partially foreseen this scenario. In fact, there are two historical comparisons that closely resemble the situation in Ukraine today, even if in different contexts. The first is Finland. In fact, after resisting Soviet aggression, Finland lost some territories but put up fierce resistance and built military prestige and national identity. Finland therefore became important because it proved to be extremely difficult to bend. So, Ukraine today is building a similar reputation because it has been proving for over 4 years that it is also extremely difficult to bend. The second comparison, however, is South Korea. Here too, the context is different, of course, but the point is that a country can come out of a war not only destroyed but also transformed. In fact, South Korea came out crushed by the Korean War fought between 1950 and 1953, a conflict that devastated the country and left it under the constant threat from the North. But it was precisely that pressure, combined with investments, American protection, and its economic and political closeness to the West, that helped the country develop, and in fact today South Korea is one of the world's leading economies. So, Ukraine could combine some elements of these two cases. Like Finland, it is building military prestige through resistance, and like South Korea, it could turn a devastating conflict and a permanent threat into industrial and technological development. The outcome will depend largely on how the conflict ends and on actions by the United States and Europe, but the possibility remains. Meanwhile, both Europe and NATO are also evolving. In fact, the Atlantic Alliance is strengthening its eastern flank, and the German-Dutch Corps will take on a command role for Allied troops in Estonia and Latvia in the event of a conflict with Russia. And an army corps can command between 40,000 and 60,000 soldiers. Then Poland is also growing, and Warsaw plans to spend 4.8% of its GDP on defense in 2026, with the Polish defense minister also calling on NATO countries to reach 5% of GDP for defense and security-related investments by 2030. Furthermore, Poland intends to sign military agreements worth about $27.41 billion as part of the European rearmament program. But be careful. All this not only tells us that Europe is changing, but also that the European military center of gravity is shifting eastward, and so if one day Ukraine joins the European Union, this change will become even more pronounced. In fact, the Union would be integrating a huge country that is economically important because of its agriculture and has enormous reconstruction needs. In other words, opportunities for European as well as Ukrainian businesses. But above all, by integrating Ukraine, Europe would be integrating a country with real military experience and a significant defense industry. But be careful, I doubt that Kyiv's entry into the European Union is imminent. Furthermore, before expanding Europe any further, we should also ask whether it's time to overcome the right of veto first. Because even today, Europe is slow due to issues related to unanimity, and adding more countries could make this situation worse in the long term. But beyond that, the integration of Kyiv into Europe, even if only partially, is already changing the European mindset, because the Union was born as a peace project, and that's fine. The problem, however, is that at a certain point many Europeans confuse peace with the absence of power and threats, and Ukraine reminded us that it doesn't work that way. Peace must also be protected with industry, with technology, and above all with deterrence. And fortunately in Kyiv they never forgot this, unlike us. And fortunately today Europe can count on a country that has learned to produce under pressure and has developed direct expertise in modern warfare. Of course, we would all be happier if the conflict had never started, but since we live in the real world, it's a good thing that Ukraine was ready, and it's a good thing that they are defending Western values. But now we also have to avoid a perhaps naive narrative. Ukraine still has huge problems, destroyed cities and occupied territories. And the West absolutely must not let its guard down, and above all, must continue to support it. However, it's clear that in the coming years, Ukraine will probably become increasingly central for Europe. And do you think Ukraine can really become a new European power? Let me know in the comments, leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy my videos. Bye!